All right, everybody. Hello and welcome to the Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. Let's do this. This week we're talking about identity politics. Now, that is just one of the most awful conversations on the left for the last several years. I'm very well aware of that. I think I tell the story at the top of this conversation of starting this podcast in 2014 in Brooklyn around a lot of, leftists who were starting publications and podcasts. And the identity politics conversation was really hot then. And it was just something that I found very, very frustrating and very oversimplified. And this whole race versus class thing began to just really drive me crazy. And I know I'm not the only one. So my guest today is someone who can help us unravel all this. His name is Asad Haider. He's one of the founding editors of Viewpoint Magazine. If you haven't checked out Viewpoint Mag, go check that out. Really good stuff. But he's written a book that I think can really take on and cut through all the bullshit that comes through this identity politics contemporary conversation. The book is called Mistaken Identity: Race and Class in the Age of Trump. He tells us all about it in this conversation. There's so much good stuff here. I think the main thing here is that Asad is helping us recover the anti-racist struggles of the past and how they connected to a wider sort of anti-capitalist revolution. He's looking at the 60s and 70s, but he's also describing and explaining the value of reading Marx in the 21st century. I think he does a great job of describing why Marx is important and also, what's happened in the many years since Marx wrote. Marx wrote in the mid-19th century, and there's been a whole lot of history since then. And I think Asad, again, does a really great job in articulating why our job is to kind of bring Marx into the 21st century. And he also describes all the different thinkers and radicals who have been doing that for decades. So quit talking about identity politics in a boring way, and let's get beyond this kind of ridiculous dichotomy of race versus class. And I think Asad's got great ideas on how to do that, and I really appreciate this conversation. We've got so much more Nostalgia Trap stuff out there. Go to nostalgiatrap.com for all of our free episodes. But we're coming up on a big milestone. Next week is our 200th episode. We're going to have a very special retrospective and conversation that we'll be posting next week. So keep your eyes out for that. And if you can support us at all, we really need it. I think I actually mentioned in this conversation that I've got 0 classes for the fall. I have literally no idea how I'm going to survive. But this podcast is, I consider it a big chunk of the academic labor I do each week. So if you appreciate the stuff that I do on the Nostalgia Trap and the stuff we're putting together, please think about supporting us. It would really help us right now. We're at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and you'll get access to all our bonus episodes and other stuff too. And it's really fun to be a part of the Nostalgia Trap Patreon club. I think that we have a lot of fun talking about these conversations in a different platform. So if you want to join that conversation, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And thank you a million times to the people who are already supporting us. It means the world to us. So I hope you appreciate this conversation. Here is me talking with Asad Haider. Okay, well, Asad, thank you so much for joining us. There's a lot of ways I could begin, but I want to kind of tell you a really quick story. I started this podcast in 2014 as I was finishing my PhD in history at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I was in contact. I started the podcast basically just to talk to other left academics and left people in media, and ended up talking to a lot of people around Jacobin, Chapo Trap House, the kind of Brooklyn left. And identity politics was a huge part of the conversation that got even huger in years since. And at some point, I just quit, dropped out of that conversation. So I guess I can start off by saluting your bravery for taking on the subject of identity politics in your book, which I want to say the title of before we get started. It's called Mistaken Identity: Race and Class in the Age of Trump. How did you get drawn into this conversation? Because for me, I was kind of at some point it felt unproductive, and I think your book is kind of addressing that unproductive conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, not a day goes by that I don't wish I could leave behind this topic. But I wrote the book because I saw what seemed to be an excessively polarized discussion about reified categories of race and class, or something called identity, which I thought was obscuring some underlying theoretical issues and political issues, lines of demarcation that had to be thought through in a different way. And so my book was really an intervention in which I tried to reframe the discussion. I tried to reframe the discussion with some analysis of the historical constitution of racial categories, with a kind of ideology critique of the category of identity, and with an account of the history of emancipatory movements, understood in a broader way than the way we would understand them if we referred them constantly to foundations and sociological categories like race or class. So it was an intervention rather than a presentation of some kind of new totalizing theory of the relation between race and class or something like that, which some people wanted, but which I did not set out to do. And I think, there's often a desire for some kind of total theory which will guarantee the correct forms of political action. I don't think it works that way. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the appealing things about your work, honestly, dude, is that you have a kind of sense of the fluid nature of things, and also a sense of history, and that part of it, I wondered, at what point. At what point did the identity politics conversation, in other words, how much of your intervention that you're doing here was kind of from looking at the left and like kind of looking at the contemporary left and wanting to intervene on the left, if that makes sense? Like, are you intervening on contemporary politics? Is that what the intervention is?
Absolutely. It was very much an intervention into the way that the contemporary left has been developing, and trying to look at, what I think are very concrete organizational and strategic problems on the left, which are only more apparent today. So I think it will be great if we don't have to reinvent the wheel and retread all the same tracks in the contemporary discussion. Though that's an optimistic. That's optimistic.
Yeah. How much do you? So my work in history was like, and part of the reason why I came to certain, I guess, ideas and values about the left, and especially when it comes to strategy and when it comes to race and things like that, is because I studied the 60s and 70s. How much of your kind of sense of identity comes from and when I say identity, I mean kind of thinking about identity's role in our larger political landscape. I mean, how much of that comes from stuff in the 60s and 70s? So I know you write about the Combahee River Collective as a really kind of important touchstone, but it feels like, how much is 60s politics and 70s politics a part of our politics today, if that makes sense? Because it feels like the left tends to especially kind of shit on a lot of that history, and think that it's irrelevant. But it feels like what you're doing is almost recovering some of the revolutionary practices and ideas of the 60s and 70s.
Part of the discussion is kind of determined by, the generation of people who were there for that, and now they think that they understand all those problems better than we do.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
one thing. And then, I think there was also an attempt to argue that the new kind of left revival today was going past the new left, to back to the old left. This is a common kind of theme that you saw among many socialist writers, that the new left was associated with, a kind of cultural politics, and that there was an older class-based form of politics that was, more grounded in institutional structures, organization. It didn't have the kind of radical democratic aspirations of the new left. Well, as you know, this is a very ahistorical point of view.
Mm-hmm.
This is, set aside the political considerations. First of all, it's highly dehistoricizing. Because, you look, for example, at people who are in the DSA who make this argument. Michael Harrington is involved in the initial kind of organizational backdrop that results in SDS, and he's an active commentator on the Port Huron Statement, and he thinks that it's not anti-communist enough.
Yeah, yes.
It's part of, and so people invoking Michael Harrington now as an alternative to the New Left. I mean, Michael Harrington is an alternative to the New Left in the sense that he represents a position which is anti-communist, which is unwilling to take a serious stand on the Vietnam War. I mean, he represents a totally retrogressive tendency in comparison to the New Left. The New Left was trying to go beyond that kind of politics. And the New Left is not some unitary thing either. What does the Port Huron Statement have to do with, say, what you might read in a newspaper of some Marxist-Leninist sect in the 70s?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it may be that the individuals involved were 10 years before inspired by the Port Huron Statement, but they represent totally different politics. So I think that we have to have a better, more nuanced understanding of the 60s and 70s. And part of that is, as I was suggesting before, a political question, because if you think that we should go back to some kind of classical class-based politics based in some purportedly more stable model of political organization, you just are completely writing off the movement which mobilized against legal segregation, against the Vietnam War, and tried to find a way to produce a revolutionary politics in the conditions of the United States. And that's a challenge few have been able to meet. The fact that groups coming out of the New Left did not succeed in finding solutions to those problems doesn't mean that we can just write them off and fail to benefit from their achievements.
Yeah, I mean, you're singing my song, man, but I mean, part of it is like when you say that about the Port Huron Statement and versus the kinds of revolutionary documents that might be coming out of some of the groups in the 70s. Yeah, it's like totally different worlds, and it makes me think. I partly called this podcast Nostalgia Trap because I think of the 60s and 70s as a big nostalgia trap, in the sense that people have a very distorted view of what happened there, and a very. I mean, for us, it's like we've talked about like Forrest Gump, and people think that that's what the kind of hippie anti-war movement. Our images are so kind of flat when we think about that stuff. But at the same time, like I in one of your interviews that I was reading, you said something that really caught my attention, because it was the same experience for me, which is that, I mean, I'm like a suburban white dude that was raised in a very Republican place, and it was in college that I first encountered kind of radical ideas and began to understand what liberalism was and what capitalism was. And it was in, there were a lot of like different moments I could point to that taught me things. But the one I think about the most is honestly taking a Black Studies class in like my second year of college and understanding kind of anti-capitalism through the lens of Black Power and revolutionary movements of the 60s and 70s. So it was, in other words, it was like my entry into understanding capitalism was through race, if that makes sense. And it seems like, I mean, what you're identifying is that where did that conversation go? Because it seems like that conversation, those links aren't as clear. I think maybe Black Lives Matter is bringing it back. I hope we can have that conversation. But what do you think happened in the sense of like those things being separated in political discourse and bringing us to this moment where like when people think about race, they don't necessarily think about anti-capitalism and stuff like that?
I think two things happened. One is the thesis, which really is the core of my book, which is that there was a neutralization of mass movements against racism.
Mm-hmm.
the mass movements against racism inspired a perspective which was fundamentally anti-capitalist. And that's part of the history that I wanted to recover in the book. But, also, it's not as though we need to, this is like a kind of problematic way of going, that we need to like justify them by saying they were anti-capitalist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the racial oppression was in itself an emancipatory struggle. It was a struggle against injustice, which is relevant to people who believe in a just society. That's why you're against capitalism, because you believe in a just society, and so these other forms of oppression are relevant. And they're centrally irrelevant, and the struggles against them, this is another argument in my book, the struggles against them are universal struggles. They're not reducible to particularism or to an identity or something like that. But so one aspect of this is that they got neutralized. And they were neutralized, I argue, by the fact that there was a contradiction between the mass character of the movements and the elite that emerged out of them. And it was an elite which increasingly, in the 70s, conceived of itself in racial terms, but turned against its grassroots base. So you have a lot of movements that put black politicians in power in different cities, and those politicians became incorporated into the political system and, for example, were the ones that imposed austerity on the working people of those cities, on black working people in those cities, but appealed to racial solidarity as a way of rationalizing that. And so that process of neutralization and the fragmentation of the previous mass movements, the kind of progressive abandonment of revolutionary aspirations, that's one way that these things got disconnected. The other way that they got disconnected, I think, is based on a kind of problem in left thinking, which I was also alluding to this, which is that the thinking of socialists has also become confined to a question, let's say, of economic distribution, and the sole horizon of politics is the redistribution of wealth within the confines of existing property relations. And that means abandoning the perspective of emancipation. That emancipation is no longer the kind of guiding light of socialism, because it's become reconceived in terms of economic redistribution. And so this means, as a result, the emancipatory character of movements against racism becomes unrecognizable if you take that perspective. And of course, that perspective in the past, that perspective was often just the racist perspective. Racists in the labor movement and in the socialist movement who failed to understand that making demands and struggling against racism as such was integral to any emancipatory movement. Now, in some cases there are outright racists, sure, in the labor and socialist movements, but it's also a result of abandoning the vantage point of emancipation and instead going into a kind of framework of economic redistribution within the existing capitalist social relations.
Yeah, and that's always such a paradox thinking about unions on the left, because the unions have been the primary structure through which working people have been able to achieve some sort of amelioration of the way capitalism is fucking with them, but at the same time, historically, like, I don't know, when it's another nostalgia trap to think about the 50s as this like time when unions were strong and working people were winning, because it was primarily a like white project. And like that part of it really, to me, is like, okay, well, if we brought back that sort of economic kind of politics that I guess, socialist groups talk about today, I assume that, the attempt is to make it more inclusive, but that doesn't seem like it's really addressing the root of the problem.
Well, people want to, I mean, this is one of the ways in which I'm arguing, we need to displace and reframe the questions, because it's, certainly true that across the history of the labor movement, we find many forms of racial exclusion. This is very important. And nobody, can seriously deny that. Even if you can point to the fact that labor movements also were the places where you saw some of the most serious expressions of cross-racial solidarity. The Communist Party, other labor organizations actually led the fight against segregation in many cases. Mm-hmm. So it's true. And then the fact that in many other cases, labor movements were exclusionary. Socialist organizations failed to recognize that fighting against the legal forms of racism and racist violence was important. So you have these contradictory tendencies.
Right.
But at the same time, part of the nostalgia trap.
Yes.
Is that we, by polarizing the discussion into something which is about, well, are we in favor of like anti-racist organizations, or are we in favor of unions? It sets the vantage point in which unions and class organization is somehow inherently going to lead to equality and inherently going to lead to social change. And that's also not true, because one of the major things that we see in this period is that the gains that were won by the labor movement happened within the context of labor allowing capital to set the terms, accepting the basic underlying premises of capitalist property relations. That's what the post-war compact was based on. And that's why it was a highly contradictory and unstable arrangement in which many of the achievements of labor, because they were internal to this internal to private property, internal to the great political power of capital, those contradictions established a situation in which the neoliberal transformation that came afterwards was really kind of facilitated. It really came out of those contradictions. So if you set up this binary, and this is something that you commonly see, you see this argument that identity politics is compatible with neoliberalism, or it's an expression of neoliberalism or something like that. Well, you also have to see how class organizations, from unions to political parties and so on, have frequently found themselves trapped within capitalist property relations and have to some extent facilitated the power of capital. That's a problem which is throughout the history of the labor movement. It's not something that's like the special problem of identity politics. This is the problem of any social movement that is challenging the existing order.
Yeah, for me, that makes me think of, I don't know, like the AFL-CIO being very supportive of Johnson and Nixon in the Vietnam War. How, I don't know, I think about this a lot, and I wonder what your take on it is, because you've read a lot more Marx than I have, I think. But what, when you think about unions, you think about basically working people like strapping their ability to survive and their wealth is strapped to the wealth of these multinational corporations who are basically like inflicting horrific imperialism around the world. So in other words, it connects the like literal material lives and fates of working people that are in unions to these like entities that are the real bad guys of capitalism. I think that's a Marxist term, actually. But does that make sense to you? Like in other words, I've never really been able to get around that.
Yeah, I think within the Marxist tradition, this is like this is a complex and evolving understanding of these institutions. So, in the mid-19th century, we're coming out of Marx and Engels trying to understand the still not fully developed process of the formation of an industrial working class. This is a process that's still happening. that they're just it's it stretches back a couple centuries, but there's a slow formation of labor movements that they've been trying to understand. The labor movements were not necessarily socialist, so they're trying to understand what's going on socially and politically.
Mm-hmm.
And they present an analysis that, look, as the industrial proletariat grows, workers will form associations with each other because they're gathered together in these big factories, they're gathered together in towns, and they create forms of association which allow them to develop a collective power which can ultimately contest the political power of the bourgeoisie. So, in a sense, they see unions and labor association in general as a way that workers sort of spontaneously start to resist capitalist competition, that they start to resist labor competition by gathering together in associations and asserting their collective interests rather than competing as individual workers. Now, that's the 1848 conception, that's like in the Communist Manifesto. That's this early conception.
Right.
And over the rest of the century, you see these processes of political revolution, the emergence of new kinds of class alliances, their disintegration. You see the emergence of political parties that represent labor. And to some extent, that's not a problem that Marx himself really addressed. It really became a kind of contemporary issue near the end of Engels' life. So he has some interventions on that. But that initial assessment was one that became very problematic for socialists that came after, because they pointed out, first of all, that the immediate everyday struggles that unions engage in the workplace and so on will be about very important issues of the living conditions of the workers, but they won't intrinsically develop into a movement against the political power of the ruling class.
Right.
That's not an automatic development. And then you have the emergence of other forms of worker organization, like the councils or the Soviets. And so then you get this kind of problem of how to compare these different institutions, which seem to be expressions of the collective organization of workers, but really look very different and act very different politically in different situations. And so in many revolutionary situations at the beginning of the 20th century, unions actually act as a force of containment, sort of blocking the further development of mass action, often directly in confrontation with workers' councils. And so some of the theory that comes out of that is that, look, actually unions didn't entirely go beyond labor market competition, because what they did essentially is they established little working class firms, that represented workers as commodity owners and sort of oversaw the transaction between the worker and the capitalist. They oversaw the sale of labor power. They tried to control the prices and set the terms, right? And so unions in themselves didn't necessarily represent principle of collective organization, but could also be caught up in the logic of competition. And that's why you needed these other forms. So one, the idea of the Workers' Council was that rather than representing the worker as commodity owner, the Workers' Council presented the idea of workers actually controlling production. Rather than setting terms on the prices, on the transaction, Workers' Councils proposed the possibility of controlling production. And that was So that's like a very substantial series of developments and debates in the history of Marxism that also end up getting forgotten, especially when we look to class as some kind of unitary category that solves the problem of what makes a movement revolutionary or what makes a movement, egalitarian or whatever.
Yeah.
That's a very contradictory issue.
I agree, and it's something that you hear a lot in the contemporary left is very, I think, really, and I don't even know who the contemporary left are. I'm just talking about the people I see on Twitter. But a lot of a lot of flattening of that sort of stuff, and a lot of assumption that the kind of that the economic part of it is going to solve these issues, and that these contradictions aren't there. In other words, there's often a treatment of class as monolithic. Like there's working people know this, and working people know this, and working people don't know this. And in other words, who are the working people we're talking about? Because it seems like, especially in the contemporary United States, it's a really kind of fractured polity, and that part of it to me is one of those contradictions that's tricky to resolve, and I haven't seen a whole lot of talk about it. Although I think that, I don't know, the Black Lives Matter movement and what's happened since the killing of George Floyd seems like it's almost forcing this conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if you think that workers will just kind of spontaneously form a class consciousness when they become aware of their objective class interests, then you're fucked. I mean,
yeah,
you will not have any successful working class organization based on that assumption, and that's why the revolutionary left consistently rejected this assumption. They said you need something else. I mean, one of those ideas was the party. That's not like a solution that we can just unproblematically take up today for a range of reasons. But there was always a recognition that this process doesn't happen mechanically. And of course, workers in their everyday experience do have a knowledge of exploitation and knowledge of inequality, but they think other things as well, and they have other ways of understanding who they are and what their lives are and what's important. And sometimes what's going to be predominant in their way of understanding themselves is going to be a national category, being an American. This may predominate over membership in a class, and it may be a racial one. It may be that being white takes precedence over thinking of yourself in terms of being a worker. And so that's why the attempt to criticize those categories, to say that that national identity is an exclusionary thing, that white identity is based on the subordination of black people. Those are important insights that can contest these other ways that people may have of understanding themselves. Because, some people say, that there's this kind of sterile discussion about do white working class people who support Trump, are they irredeemably racist, or do they have a kind of economic anxiety and a spontaneous kind of opposition to the existing system that would allow them to be mobilized for the left, for Sanders or whatever? And that's a kind of a misleading discussion, because if those people, and I don't want to talk about some unitary thing called the white working class, but let's say people who are lower in income, who voted for Trump or whatever, if they are sort of incorporated into organizations that think in terms of class solidarity and oppose racism, oppose misogyny, and so on, then they can clearly make the equation and say, okay, Trump represents these forms of division among us. Trump is trying to play up hatred and forms of discrimination that we oppose because they're wrong. And so we're not going to support him. I mean, that's the outcome you want, because otherwise, if people are susceptible to Trump's rhetoric, if they're willing to go along with kind of what appears to be a populist opposition to neoliberalism and just tolerate the racism and sexism and so on, if they are led to the conclusion that we have to be against racism and sexism, then they will not attach that impulse to Trump. They will have to attach it elsewhere.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, like I said, I mean, anti-racism was kind of my entry into the left, and so it's kind of a weird conversation to see happen years later. I'm wondering if I can ask you about something petty, which is Twitter drama. There was a tweet, I don't know if you saw it today, about reading Marx, and the idea. The original tweet actually made me think, wow, I'm so glad I'm going to talk to Asad later, because this seems like it almost is a subject made for him to untangle, which the person on Twitter said, like, you shouldn't read Marx, you should read, like, I don't have the tweet in front of me, but it was basically like, Marx is an old dead white guy, and you should read, like, women and people of color and queer people like Angela Davis, etc. And it was just kind of a bizarre tweet that started off a whole conversation about reading Marx and whether or not that's a valuable thing. But I'm wondering, since you're a person that I feel like reading your stuff, you have an interest in reading Marx, obviously, and you see value in it. And I wonder if, like, when did that start for you? When did you first pick up a book about Marxism, and how did that interest start? And maybe if you can say a little bit about whether or not we should read Marx today.
I read Marx because what I always recount is that you would hear people say that, some liberals and so, or your elementary school teachers say, well, maybe communism was a good idea in theory, but it didn't work in practice. I thought, just as a kid, before you're trained in all kinds of logical fallacies, you think, what does that mean? Because if it didn't work in practice, then it wouldn't be a good idea in theory. So there's a disconnect there. So I thought, let me go and read it and see what the idea actually is. So I picked up the Communist Manifesto. And of course, one thing that's striking to anyone who reads practically anything written by Marx is that it does not present a vision for a communist society. Mm-hmm. So if you go there looking for that, you end up disappointed. But I got something else from it, which was that it presented an account of the world in which poverty and inequality were not accidental or aberrations, but were actually generated by this social system, which is capitalism. And that to me was an extraordinary insight, because, I had observed, the scale of poverty which exists on a global scale, but also which exists within the United States. And it was clear that liberal explanations, the kind of dominant explanations that would, let's say, argue that this was some kind of failure of policy, or, the right-wing explanations which would say that people who are in these positions are responsible for their own lot. These were just very clearly refuted in this short text from the 19th century, which made this still relevant argument that, okay, that's actually engendered by the system. And so that, for me, was very important. And and then that was reinforced by something else, which was precisely what you mentioned, which was that I was also very interested, as a way of thinking through my own experiences and trying to understand the way that the dominant society operated. I was very interested in studying the history of race and racism and movements against racism, which were, for me, a great source of inspiration that, made me interested in politics. And I saw that the relevance of Marx's analysis was corroborated by all of these figures who were in various Black liberation movements. First I read about the Black Panthers and then other similar groups, and they verified the relevance and importance of Marx's insights. So to me, that was, and actually Angela Davis was one of them also.
Mm-hmm.
I read her autobiography. I read Women, Race, and Class, and I had read Huey Newton's memoirs. Those stand out as major readings at that time, and they reinforced for me the relevance of Marxism. And it was, for me, reading this material at that time, especially because there was, this predates the contemporary kind of socialist discussions that are happening now. I mean, this predates that by 20 years,
Yeah.
15, 20 years.
Yeah, same for me. That's what's kind of a bizarre position to be in.
Right. So it was unimaginable to me, actually, that you would set up some kind of opposition between Marxism and the movements against racism, because these were the only people that were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
It was like, if you wanted to go beyond, I mean, like, okay, at that time when I was a kid, I mean, people were very nakedly racist. There's this discussion about wokeness and how it fits into neoliberalism, but, well into neoliberalism, growing up in central Pennsylvania, people were just racists.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, and that's still true in many contexts. So it was apparent to me that the people who were against that and who were trying to take that seriously, they also understood the problems of class and class inequality, and they believed in really structural social change. They didn't think that you could just readjust the existing system. They said you have to transform the whole system if you're going to get rid of these injustices. And yeah, so it was unimaginable to me that you would have either forms of this kind of, either side of this separation. Either that you would have people saying, well, racism is this independent thing that, we can't talk about class because that will obscure that racism is like the fundamental source of, it's like at the root of white,
yep.
right, whatever. And so Marx is caught up in that. All of the idea of socialism is caught up in that. So that position was inconceivable, and just as inconceivable was the position which would say that, Marxism is just about class, and if you talk about race, then you're getting distracted, or you're just buying into neoliberalism or something like that. These are both unimaginable positions to me.
Yeah, I agree. And we had, I think it was about a year and a half ago, we had Robin Kelly on, who is really, really great on these issues, and I think says it so much better than I'm ever able to in terms of entangling and re-entangling those things, if that makes sense. And just again, for me, being exposed to this stuff in the late 90s through Black Studies departments, which were themselves products of 1960s and 70s revolutionaries. The fact that a Black Studies department happened to be at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I went to school, was a really lucky thing for me, because I encountered radical ideas that were exciting to me through the lens of anti-racism, and always kind of thought of it that way. And then, as time went on and I got older, and watching the development of a more developed socialist, media world and everything like that happening, but then seeing it not really kind of match that revolutionary practice or revolutionary ideas that I'd been exposed to earlier. It's disturbing. The other thing I was thinking about Marx and the kind of cliche things that people say. The other thing that you hear people say besides, it works in theory but not in practice, is, well, Marx forgot about human nature. Marx forgot about a little thing called human nature, as if like the kind of values of capitalism are just kind of inborn in people. And that part of it is kind of like, I mean, didn't Marx write like nothing but stuff about human nature?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting. We'll get into like a kind of tricky area here. I think that Marx, there's a portion of Marx's work which is really preoccupied with trying to understand human nature as the vantage point for the critique of bourgeois society. You know, he doesn't have the point that he's writing about this stuff. He doesn't yet have the concept of the capitalist mode of production. You know, this is 1844. Capitalist mode of production, the concept which appears the next year. So, as a critique of bourgeois society, he's using the vantage point of human nature, but actually, what he says about human nature is derived almost 100% from the critique of religion that preceded him. That is the critique which said that Christianity was a distorted expression of human nature, and that we needed to transcend that in order to go beyond superstition and have a truly emancipated society. You know, because religion was superstition, but it wasn't just a mistaken idea. It was an actual force of oppression. And so Marx just completely took that up, and he kind of modified it so that he made it about private property rather than about religion. And that was kind of him trying to work through the framework that he had inherited, trying to bring these ideas to bear on understanding the economic system. But it wasn't, he didn't work it out to his own satisfaction, and he left, as they would say, Marx and Engels would say later about another work, you know, it was left to the gnawing criticism of the mice. Because this ultimately wasn't adequate. So I would argue that Marx's great insight is actually to say that human nature is an ideological concept. It doesn't actually explain to us what happens in society, because the capitalist society, this was the problem of political economy which preceded him, and which he went on to kind of criticize at length, was that political economy said, okay, capitalism is based on the human propensity for trade. Part of people's nature is to engage in trade. And Marx's method in his later works, you know, in Capital, and the point where he's really elaborated his own independent method, is to say the fact that people are constantly engaged in trade is a really historically specific phenomenon which results from the fact that they're separated from their means of subsistence. If they don't have direct access to their means of subsistence, then they're forced to depend on the market to trade to get the things that they need. So just the fact that, you know, that like I have a 6-pack and you've got a pack of cigarettes and I trade you a beer for a cigarette, that's got nothing to do with a society in which people have to trade for survival. You know, to conflate just like the fact of trading with this really specific social system in which I have to enter into a contract of exchange in order to get money so that I can exchange that money for food, that is a really specific form of social organization which arises from the separation of people for means of subsistence and integration into the capitalist mode of production. And so human nature was just the wrong question, because if you want to have a debate like and say, well, actually there's also the human nature to like, for me to have empathy with you or something like that. Actually, Adam Smith made that argument before he even wrote The Wealth of Nations. He has in the theory of moral sentiments, he elaborates theories of empathy and so on. That's still part of the old system of thought. That's still ideological. that's why the Marx's really critical thought is about looking at those things, these aspects of like our human experience, the way that we kind of spontaneously understand the world as being effects of the social structure. And so that this discussion about human nature, actually, we have to say, wrong question.
No, that makes it really clear. And that part of it, I mean, it makes me want to ask you, in terms of reading Marx, were you reading this stuff in the context of studying in an academy, like in a university, or were you reading this stuff on your own? Because I feel like there are different ways to get at this kind of stuff. And for me, like, a part of my radicalization happened totally outside of the university context, and some of it within, just by virtue of the fact that I encountered the texts there. But I guess I'm asking kind of, what place do you see? I know it's a big question, but what place do you see in terms of, like, I don't know, revolutionary practice, academia? Because academia has been, so kind of scolded over the years, I think, especially by revolutionaries who see it as a kind of retrograde capitalist institution. And certainly, like, I've had experiences in the academy that have proven that to me. But at the same time, I'm very much invested in the university as a place that has a lot of potential for revolutionary practice. Do you have a hot take on any of that stuff?
I mean, look, I mean, I had to study Marxism on my own for most of the time, and I found ways to make my academic training oriented towards allowing me to do that. Mm-hmm. Basically, it wasn't like the idea that universities are hotbeds of Marxism is like a beautiful fantasy. That would be so nice, Right. It would be great, but it's not true. And so it was more that I found ways to, in my education, have the institution kind of leave me alone so that I could do this work as much as possible on my own. Mm. And that's why, so at the beginning of graduate school, I started Viewpoint, and, that along with Salar Mohandes, we started Viewpoint, and that took up a lot of my time, and school was very secondary to that. And I was eventually able to, kind of justify a lot of the work that I had done independently on Marxist theory as, I was able to justify it as like my dissertation, but that isn't actually a viable path in the academy. It's not actually been, it didn't set me up for very smooth career development. We'll just put it that way. But what's the potential of the academy? And look, at one level, it's just another workplace, and a lot of the people who are in my kind of generation of, PhDs and so on, we're going to be adjuncts who are, teach now that classes, they have an excuse to put all these classes online. Think how many more classes they're going to try to get us to teach.
Oh, dude. Yeah, it's a nightmare. It is a total nightmare.
You're gonna have people who are getting paid by the class, making, poverty level income, no benefits, and they're going to be teaching like 6 Zoom classes per semester. Mm-hmm. Because that's going to happen now to a lot of people.
That's a best case scenario for me, dude. Like, I'm like the Cal State system where I was teaching 3 classes every semester just as an adjunct. They just, they announced that like they're going all online, and that like made, I guess, enrollment drop. And they've told me that they have like 0 classes for me. So it's like at this point, like 6 Zoom classes would be survival in the fall. Otherwise, I'm like facing like, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. And that part of it is really, really depressing and makes me think, well, what am I even thinking about the academy as a revolutionary institution? This is the institution that just fucked me over. And that part of it is really tricky to think about, especially as a public institution.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that's one aspect of it, which is that academia is a workplace, and you have to, there's organizing at a workplace, and I was part of the Graduate Student Workers Union for all of graduate school, I spent a lot of that's also somewhere I spent a lot of my time. One of the problems you encounter there, and this is true also with public school teachers, nurses, or other kind of professional fields. People conceive of themselves as professionals, and so they don't want to think in terms of union organization. They don't want to think of themselves organizing as workers. That's a problem you see with academics, because academics have very high opinions of themselves. They think that they're special and that they will advance in their careers as professionals, and that thinking of themselves as workers would be degrading. So that's something that has to be combated in academia, but it's not unique to academia. It's true of a wide range of professional fields. It was true of artisanal craft workers.
Mm-hmm.
It was true of skilled workers, who had many craft unions in the past, and so that's one issue. But then, along with being a workplace, the university is also an ideological state apparatus, right? That's the other thing.
Mm-hmm.
Also, what we do for a living in the academy is train people in the dominant ideology, right? And so, that's a reason why academics are so inclined to buy into the underlying system. But that also means that it's a place where ideological struggles happen. So you have people who are in these institutions who are trying to counteract the dominant ideology. And they exist, and they are doing important and heroic work in exposing students to other ideas, in using their platform to criticize the dominant society rather than rationalize it, and also taking advantage of the accumulated knowledge of this society in order to turn it towards insights and lessons that can be used in the struggle for change. So, the various different kinds of workers can have different kinds of specific effects, like a strike by truckers can shut down the circulation of commodities and really totally disrupt the economy at that level. And so the ideological struggle that intellectuals can wage has the potential to counteract the effects of ideology on students and on the public, and to provide alternative ways of thinking. But that's a struggle, and the dominant character of the institution is always going to try to repress that. So that you'll see the contradiction. I mean, it's not, some people are very, my inclination is to be very dismissive of academics, but, let's be more realistic. I mean, some people, so I'm, for now, I'm actually in 2 weeks, I will no longer be an academic. I don't know. Maybe I will become one again in the fall. I don't know yet. But that's the state of the job market right now. Mm-hmm. So up to now, I am an academic. And, some people may accuse me of just being an academic who's just caught up in my own position and justifying my own position in that institution. But actually, the reality is that it's contradictory, and you see the struggles. And so sometimes academics will be able to publish oppositional ideas, and they will be able to teach them to their students. And sometimes they will be prevented from doing so, but the struggle will always be there. So, you can't reduce it to one or the other.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's something we've talked about on this show before, is that the sort of class character of your typical academic has changed over the years. And there are a lot of, the whole adjunctification and neoliberalization of the university is partly responsible for creating this precarious class of academics, and very educated people who have PhDs and have a kind of complex understanding of things all of a sudden cast into a really shitty economic situation seems like there's potential for I don't know, some sort of politics come out of that. And that's my wager, at least, is that there are a growing kind of army of disaffected intellectuals who might be able to get something together. I don't know. I'm leaving it to other people to do that, though. But part of it, I mean, first of all, Asad, thank you so much for speaking with me. This was really fun. I'm still thinking about what you said at the beginning, which is that the development of an elite, can often like kind of take the strength from these movements and ruin them, and ruin their ability to really challenge capitalism in any meaningful way. And it's interesting because like Black Lives Matter is an organization that doesn't seem like it's an organization that's like interested in, or at least it seems like an organization that's conscious of that. And that to me seems like a different kind of moment than I've seen in the last many, many years of watching the left. I don't know if that rings true to you as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like any movement, it's going to have these contradictions. You're going to have, nonprofit organizations, liberal elites trying to contain the radical potential of the movement. And a lot of people use that as a way of writing it off. But as I said, that's completely wrong-headed, because you have the same dynamics in labor movements.
Mm-hmm.
So what we see is an opening, a period in which the outcome isn't determined yet. And the reality is that there's a major mobilization of people against the repressive state apparatus and against racism, which is that could be the potential for developing a much broader movement, like an ongoing movement.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an extraordinary opportunity that anybody who's on the left has to be seriously involved with.
Yeah. Oh, man, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I want to mention your book one more time because people should go and get it, because I think you unpack this stuff so brilliantly, and it's called Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump. Asad Haider, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, huge thank you to Asad Haider. Go pick up his book, Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump. I think it will help a lot of you have better conversations about this identity politics thing that's been plaguing the left for years, and even the fucking right uses identity politics now against us. So it's really important, I think, that we understand these nuances and we get over this lame race versus class thing and begin to understand how anti-racist struggle is really central to any kind of revolutionary struggle, and you're looking at it on the streets right now. So thanks so much, Asad, and thanks so much for everyone who's supporting the show. If you want to do that, you can do it at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We really appreciate it. All right, I hope you have a good week. Take care, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.